Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be joining us from. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual home and our first event of the new academic year. Today's conversation is presented as part of our online-only series called Inside the Center, which highlights the research and writing of our current and recent fellows. Always our purpose in these events is to gather attention for some of the provocative work that's happening at the SHC, and we're grateful to you for being with us today. Whoever you may be, past or current fellow, member of the Stanford community, or simply an interested person, you're always welcome to join us for these events. More and more over these last several years, we've come to see our mission as that of a humanities center, not only for Stanford and the surrounding community, but for the world beyond. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of the window where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. The SHC is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we both house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year, we will have around 50 working under our roof. And we present events like this one that are open to everyone. The work of the fellows is enlivened by the visiting speakers, while the visitors encounter an audience that includes not only Stanford scholars and students, but many others who have met here for the year or simply come together for this occasion. At some point, the research conceived or realized at the Stanford Humanities Center gets published or otherwise made public, and that's what we're celebrating today, new work by a former fellow. As a former fellow myself, I find it encouraging that we've developed a medium for hearing about people's current projects, which may sometimes start from a seed that was planted 5, 10, or more years ago here at the SHC. Inside the Center is one of several series we've launched over the past few years, and we intend to keep providing you with events of similar quality and a lot of diversity. And so one more note before I introduce our speakers. I'd like to remind you that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And also, if you'd like to submit a question to the main speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it following the initial conversation. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming back Laura J. Martin, who was a fellow with us during the 2021 academic year. Laura is a historian and ecologist who studies how people shape the habitats of other species. She is the author of Wild by Design, The Rise of Ecological Restoration, which she will talk about today. Since it was published in 2022, the book has received a lot of attention. The Los Angeles Review of Books called it an essential read for anyone who wants to understand the implications of our interventions. Laura has published in venues such as Environmental History, Science, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and many other places. Her research is honored as a winner of the 2023 Falling Walls competition for breakthroughs in science. She is Associate Professor of Environmental Studies at Williams College and a former fellow of the Harvard Center for the Environment, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Science Foundation. She is currently working on a new book about the connection between synthetic herbicides and global biodiversity loss. Joining Laura today is Tracy Bryn Voiles, who will offer a response. Now, Laura is already a member of the SHC community by virtue of her time with us during the all-pandemic year of 2021. But Tracy, we consider that you are joining our community by participating in today's event, and we hope to see and hear more of your work in the future. Tracy Bryn Voiles is a professor and head of the Department of History at North Carolina State University. She is the author of 2 books, The Settler Sea, California's Salton Sea and the Consequences of Colonialism, published by the University of Nebraska Press in 2021, which won the prestigious Cowie Prize for the best work on the American West. And before that, Wastelanding, Legacies of Uranium Mining in Navajo Country, published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2015. Thank you both for joining us, and let me turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Roland.
Yes, thank you, Roland. It is an honor to be here. I appreciate that lovely introduction. And I want to also extend a warm welcome to everybody who's in the audience today to be here for this conversation with Dr. Laura Martin about a fascinating and important new book. Welcome to you, Laura, as well. I'm particularly honored to be here with you all today and grateful to the SHC for creating this space for us to chat about the book and about some of the broader implications of your work. And I'm particularly grateful for Roland's invitation to join the SHC. I happily accept. So welcome, Laura. It's good to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.
I want to start by thanking you. You've written a book that isn't just informative, but is also a pleasure to read, which isn't an easy feat. This book comes out as a vital intervention at an important time, which I think is reflected in the amount of attention that the book has gotten since its publication, which is well deserved. Laura, in this work, you've crafted a narrative that's based on extensive archival research that in the broadest sense is seeking to help us better understand relationships between people and nature and how they've changed over time, which is really at the heart of the best kind of work in environmental history. I loved reading this book. I love the opportunity to read the book, and I'm really excited for the audience to both get a sense of what your argument is and what the intervention is that you're making here. And it's also my hope that this conversation could keep us attuned to the stakes of the story that you're telling, which you make clear in the book are quite urgent. So at a time of climate change and immense instability in the way that we do environmental regulation and management, this kind of urgent project that you're asking us to consider the social and political implications of that kind of work are really important to understand. So before we get to those big picture kinds of ideas, I wondered, since we have you here to tell a little bit about the origins of the work and some of the work that you actually did in the SHC to get this book off the ground. I wonder if you could tell the audience a little bit about the book's origin stories. How did you come to the project? And I'm particularly curious to know how it changed over the course of your research.
Sure. Thank you, Tracy, for being here today. And your work has hugely influenced me. So it's a deep pleasure to be in conversation today. I came to this book project from a background in the sciences and ecology. And I found the humanities through a kind of meandering pathway that led me there. I started my career in wetlands ecology. And my kind of overarching goal was to save species. Species are, there's 8.7 million species on Earth, including humans. They're facing unprecedented challenges with climate change, with habitat fragmentation, with persistent pollutants. And I wanted to save wetland species. And so I got a degree in wetlands ecology. I was working on invasive species. I was working on Phragmites australis, or common reed, which is a species that has a native genotype, a native population on the east coast of the United States, but also has an introduced genotype or populations that have been introduced from Europe and Africa. And this was considered by federal and state land managers to be an incredibly problematic species that was outcompeting native species that managers valued. But you can't tell the native and the introduced populations apart by eye. You need to do genetic testing in order to tell them apart. So I was working with managers that were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars spraying herbicides from helicopters over large swaths of wetlands in order to try and eradicate this one species. And I realized that the work I was doing on the field ecology side was not answering the question that it kept occurring to me is why are we doing this? And what are the politics behind these environmental decisions? I got more and more into the policy world before I discovered environmental history through just kind of for fun reading a few books as a graduate student, and realized that there was an entire community of humanists that were asking the sorts of questions that I was becoming interested in terms of how have scientific ideas about nature changed over time, and how has the relationship between science and policy changed over time? And what are the kind of ethical and political implications of doing things like killing species by spraying wetlands with herbicides? And so I pivoted. I trained in environmental history and history of science. And when I started the project, I was imagining writing a book specifically about the history of invasive species management. But I realized as I started doing archival research that to tell that history, I needed to immerse myself in a broader history of ecological restoration, which I define a little bit differently than the Society for Ecological Restoration defines it, the kind of international scientific body that advocates for restoration ecology. They define restoration as assisting an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. In writing this book, I wanted, that can be many different things. That can be spraying herbicide from helicopters. That can be breeding endangered species to put them back in the landscape. That can be using snipers to kill invasive non-native goats in the Galapagos, right? There's all these different practices that all fall under the framework of assisting ecosystems. So for my definition, and in the book, I'm focused specifically on efforts to remove species from the landscape or put species back into the landscape. And I think of restoration as an attempt to co-design nature with non-human participants. And kind of that, and we can get into the weeds about this, but I think that makes it a unique form of environmental management that's distinct from preservation, from kind of setting aside areas and hoping that they can restore or heal themselves. And it's different from conservation, which has more of a kind of economic bent, thinking about sustainable harvest of species and whatnot.
Absolutely. It's fascinating to hear you talk about how you moved from a scientific background to the policy world and then into the humanities and environmental history, because those are the worlds that you traverse in the book, and you do so really fluently. You create really a sense of authenticity around the way that you're talking about those kinds of ways of thinking about restoration in the book, and it explains a lot to hear you talk about what your professional background is and understanding that. Also in thinking about these kind of twin themes throughout the book of restoration and destruction, right? What does it mean to do restoration by destruction of particular kinds of species, and how and why do you go about doing that? These are some of these big questions that I think are so exciting. If I may, I'm going to pick up on the last piece that you mentioned there, which is the difference between restoration and conservation, or even preservation. So I'd like to ask you about some of the bigger picture implications of the work here, and what you see as your primary argument. The book is really, from the lens of an environmental historian, the book is making this very important historiographical intervention in thinking about not just conservation and preservation, which are really kind of thought of as by historians as the sort of twinned origin points of contemporary environmental movements. But you're actually inserting restoration into that historiography as an important interlocutor with those other kinds of forms, an important and distinct interlocutor with those other forms of environmentalism, going back to the earliest parts of the 20th century. So I think that that kind of intervention is fascinating. As a historian, I want to ask some deeply boring questions about that intervention that you're making, but I'll save those for later. We'll stick with the things that are less niche, I think, for the purposes of this conversation. But your argument is really about the nuances and the complexity of this restoration work in the history that you're tracing, and in particular, the way that it is never isolated from social and political implications. So your book really stays attuned to not just the impacts of ecological restoration on the non-human world, but also what are the social and political factors that are both influencing how it's done and the decisions that are being made, but also its impact on human communities in ways that, perpetuates social injustices or other kinds of harm. So that for me was really the essence of the argument, and the part of it that really sat with me for a while after I read the book. I wonder if you could tell me if you see that also as the primary contribution of the work and a good assessment of what the argument is, or if you could say more about what you want readers to most take away.
Yeah, there's a few different takeaways for readers. I think at the broadest level, I argue that restoration could be in its best form, in its ideal form, could be a mode of reconciliation with the human past. And this is where I think restoration practice really is a blend of the sciences and the humanities. I mean, I would argue that all policy, period, and all environmental management is at this intersection of the sciences and the humanities. But restoration, I think, is inherently a hopeful practice. It is acknowledging environmental harm and trying to do something to reverse that harm. And I track in the arc of the book tracks the history of ideas and history of regulation and policy around how people attempted to undo environmental damage. And those attempts shift over time from, a focus on trying to restore single species to a focus on restoring ecosystem level processes, and then a shift from seeing in the early 20th century, seeing many forms of environmental restoration as pretty easily reversible with time and human effort, to environmental scientists and activists really switching to, and I argue this is tied to kind of Cold War ideology and nuclear weapons, but to envisioning that there are types of ecological harm that are irreversible and that cannot be easily brought back or restored. Something that surprised me, I think another takeaway from the book is that when I was coming through, when I was a wetlands ecologist, the focus of restoration really was on recreating historical ecosystems. To use peat cores and fossil pollen, or to use colonial tree surveys or whatever kind of natural or textual archives to say, okay, these are the species that were on the landscape before. This is what we're trying to restore. And we're specifically trying to restore a pre-1492 baseline. So when I went to research this book, I expected that focus on restoring historical fidelity, on restoring historic ecosystems, would be something that would be there from the beginning of restoration. And was very surprised to find that it was not until the 1980s that ecologists or federal or state land managers really cared about restoring a specifically pre-colonial vision of ecosystems. And that's the stakes of that are that there's a lot of debate today over concepts like novel ecosystems and the question of the wisdom of trying to restore ecosystems to the past and hold them kind of in a past state versus planning for the future and anticipating climate change. And so you can imagine if you are trying to restore a forest in Vermont, where I live, you need to make a decision whether you are trying to bring back species that were there in a particular time, or whether you are planting species that are predicted to thrive 100 years in the future with the climate changes that are coming. And so I think it was liberatory to realize that this intense emphasis on historical fidelity in environments is a pretty recent phenomenon. And I go into the book about my hypotheses as to why that happens at that time. But I think, and the other intervention with the book is just to assemble, to take a first stab at assembling an archive of restoration. Unlike some other modes of environmental management, there's no one agency that does restoration. It is technically not the formal mandate of any federal environmental agency. It has arisen in regulatory code for multiple agencies, including primarily the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but also the National Park Service, also many state environmental conservation and environment departments. Nonprofits do a lot of restoration work, and land trusts do a lot of restoration work. Private individuals do a lot of restoration work. Increasingly, the UN just declared this to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. And this summer, the EU just passed a law that will require EU countries to restore 20% of nature in their borders. And so you're now seeing also corporations funding a lot of restoration. I talk at the end of the book about the kind of consolidation and corporatization of restoration. But it was also, I'd say, a project in bringing together examples from these different entities that do restoration and to look at what is common between them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly, to hear you put it in that context, it certainly strikes me how timely the work is, and what you're providing is essentially a monograph that's demanding that if this work is, when this work happens, it needs to be done well and with lots and lots of critical thinking and engagement. And of course, one of the major takeaways here that I kept sort of coming back to is that in order to be a good restorationist, you have to also be a good environmental historian. So, and you have to draw from the best kind of scholarship on both sides of that kind of work. So I think that the poses some really fascinating questions about how this unfolds, and I think we'll come back to that at the end of the conversation. I was hoping that you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about some of the images in the book. One of my favorite things as a reader about the way that you constructed the book is that you chose really fantastic images and photographs that do a good job of illustrating and illuminating your stories. And I wanted to ask if you could tell the audience about a few of them, talk us through some of the stories behind some of these images. And we'll start, I think, maybe with this one, which was actually my favorite. So I wonder if you could tell us about what is going on in this photograph, and why, in particular, if you could tell us why you chose this story as the one that would open the book. So this is the first image in the book and the one that comes in the introduction. So what was it about this story that for you really encapsulated that larger argument?
Sure. So what we are looking at is two humans dressed up as adult cranes, attempting to teach a baby crane that's been hatched in captivity to fly and to follow them. And these are volunteers with the International Crane Foundation doing this work about a decade ago in Wisconsin. And I chose this image because I think it really, the biggest question of the book is, what does it mean to care for wild species? We know what it means to care for domesticated species, for pets or for houseplants. With pets, we provide them with shelter and food and like Halloween costumes and opportunities for play. But we imagine wild species to be outside of the borders of human society. We imagine them to be autonomous, to be making their own decisions about how they live. I would say that is, what one thing that people value in wild species, and what makes people think of those species as wild. And so it is intensive interventions like dressing up as a crane and teaching the crane how to behave, right? That really, I think, challenge this divide between wild and unmanaged. And many of the wild species that people care about are deeply managed today and will need to be in the future because of climate change, because of habitat fragmentation. And so this work was both, the work of the International Crane Foundation was both celebrated. These images make really good news stories. People loved this project and donated to this project. Other environmentalists hated this project and felt that this kind of intense, intimate work with the cranes was destroying something fundamental about cranes, their ability to live outside of human society. The work was attempting to restore crane populations. So whooping cranes territory once extended from the Arctic to central Mexico and from like Utah to New Jersey. But the whooping cranes populations declined dramatically because of settler draining of wetlands, as well as settler hunting. So by the 1930s, there were only around 35 individuals left in the wild. So work like in this photograph has led to a rebounding to the scenario where we now have around 600 or so whooping cranes in the wild today. But then people can test, what does are they actually in the wild? They are so heavily monitored and managed. So I think that this image really visually captures the way in which there is something startling or uncomfortable about the idea of managing wild species.
Yeah, and I think that you spoke there to, I think, one of the critical questions that you raise and explore throughout the work, which is, what do we mean when we say wild? And what do we mean when we say design? I think really pushing on those two, this sort of two poles of the title of the book, is one of the most critical questions there. Does wild mean unmanaged, or can it mean unmanaged? And how does that point to, those kinds of ways of thinking about humans and nature as part of these kinds of, hermetically sealed, separated binary categories? I think your work really troubles that binary in ways that are incredibly productive. And thinking about the history of the idea of wildness, as well. So I think that's great. So if this is the image that serves to introduce your larger argument, the next image that I want to talk about, this one is where your historical narrative really begins. So as I mentioned earlier, part of one of the important contributions of this work is that you're making a historiographical intervention in U.S. environmental history, in which you argue that ecological restoration in the U.S. is actually much older than it's commonly understood. So people have generally dated restoration work to the 1980s, or maybe to the middle of the 20th century with Aldo Leopold. You begin at the turn of the 20th century. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why, and also what is going on in this photograph that we're looking at here.
Yeah, so we're looking, it might be hard to tell on your screens, but we're looking at a photograph of a giant pile of bison skulls. And this is a photograph taken in 1892 in Michigan. It's actually a pile outside of a glue works in Michigan, but it is a visual reminder of the scale of settler destruction of large mammals across the country. In the decades after the Civil War, American settlers killed around 5 million bison. They did this for various reasons. Some hunted for profit, some were hunting because they saw the extermination of the buffalo as a means to force Native American communities into the reservation system. And by the late 1880s, there were the number of bison in the United States had been reduced from millions to fewer than 1,000. So a group of naturalists got together in the early 1900s and founded the American Bison Society in 1905. And their work is often celebrated as a success. Today, there's more than 400,000 bison in North America. But less often do we talk about where this restoration work occurred, on what land it occurred and how it became available. So in researching Wild by Design and in trying to look at earlier efforts to restore single species, to restore species of economic interest, I found that the first sites in what is now the U.S. National Wildlife Refuge System, which is administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service, were Native American lands that were systematically dismantled under the Dawes Act as the federal government was working to erode tribal sovereignty. So East Coast white restorationists who wanted access to bison as tourists or as hunters convinced the federal government to take land from Native American tribes and to put it toward restoration. So I argue that this is the first case in the United States of large-scale single species restoration. It is also a reminder that restoration, the pursuit of biodiversity restoration, has often been at the expense of already marginalized people. And we see that, I end the book talking about the large-scale restoration projects that we see today in forest-based carbon sequestration, where nonprofits and scientists from Europe, from the United States, are going into other countries and taking hold of large areas of land to plant trees and sequester carbon, often kicking people out of their homes. And there's an Oxfam study in 2011 that showed that in Uganda, one forest-based carbon sequestration project alone evicted 11,000 people from their homes.
Yeah, so it connects directly across time to these stories that you're telling in the early part of the book about the relationship between restoration work and Indigenous dispossession.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So in like many early 20th century stories, eugenics also plays an interesting role in these origin stories as well. And I think the way that this story that's connected with this image sort of sets out your larger argument is really effective and in that piece of the work. Okay, if we jump ahead to the next image. So this moves us quite a bit farther ahead in the historical timeline of the book. This is an image that comes in chapter 5. I wonder if you could tell us what we're seeing here and tell us a bit about the story that's associated with this image. And in particular, how it constitutes a turning point in your narrative. And what was really fascinating to me, and I hope you talk a little bit about this, is that, ecologists at this point in your story begin to actively work toward irreversibly destroying ecosystems on purpose. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that was conceived as a restoration project.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is an aerial photograph of study site at the Brookhaven National Laboratory in the 1960s. It's 6 months after an experiment that placed cesium, radioactive cesium, at the center of that circle. And the bright line you see is a road leading into that circle. But the circle of death you see kind of around that point source of gamma radiation is what the forest looked like 6 months after, with 6 months of continuous exposure to a point source of gamma radiation. And this is a totally fascinating moment in the history of ecology. I argue in the book, and a few other environmental historians have pointed to the fact that ecosystem restoration really has its origins in atomic colonialism, that it was ecologists who the Atomic Energy Commission kind of sent to detonation sites in the American Southwest and the Pacific Proving Grounds, Bikini and Enewetak Atoll, who demonstrated through new radioisotope technologies the movement of nutrients and materials between species through the food web. It was a new way of kind of visualizing food webs that kind of led to the ecosystem concept. So kind of building off of that work, I realized, in the book, I'm tracking the shift from single species to ecosystem restoration. So understanding that atomic history is essential to that shift. But I realized in doing this research, I uncovered these experiments that were doing something new. So once the partial test ban treaty banned above ground detonations, of which there were hundreds around the world, banned them in 1962, scientists lost access to their ecologists lost access to their study sites where they were studying the flow of nutrients among organisms, where they were kind of studying what a post-apocalyptic landscape might look like. And so they began to simulate World War III with experiments where there was no detonation, but they still put radiation into the landscape. This happened in Puerto Rico, this happened across the American Southwest, and this happened on Long Island, and there's still radioactive deer today at Long Island because of these experiments at Brookhaven National Laboratory. And I argue that they're really important to know about today because they so deeply influenced restoration ideas in restoration and ideas in climate science as well. These are the experiments through which ecologists began to argue that diversity confers resiliency, that an ecosystem that has lots of species is better able to withstand a disturbance than an ecosystem with only a few species. And the disturbance that they were using was radiation. And this became the model for imagining what pollutants do to ecosystems, imagining what climate change does to ecosystem, imagining what hurricanes do to ecosystems. This also, to get into the weeds a little bit, was a new way of thinking about the ability of species to withstand disturbance. So in this picture, we can't see the individual species, but the scientists at Brookhaven found that conifers were better able to withstand radiation than broadleaved trees. So they said, conifers are more, or broadleaf trees are more radiosensitive than conifers. And this way of dividing up species by how resilient they were was also a new way of categorizing species, and one that influences climate change research today, where we're thinking about which species are more drought tolerant or less drought tolerant, which species are more or less storm resistant. And finally, beyond the kind of diversity stability hypothesis, this is the moment where ecologists really start writing about the idea of irreversible change. And this again is where that twinning of destruction and restoration comes in. It's through experimental destruction that ecologists attempted to learn what the limits of restoration were, and where they had fluctuating ideas about the limits of natural regeneration or natural restoration versus human-aided regeneration or restoration.
Yeah, I think your book does a fascinating job of sort of situating and contextualizing how ecologists were arriving at these kinds of conclusions and constructing these sorts of research projects that today, when we're thinking about the role of irradiation on restoration projects, I mean, it seems darkly comic in the way that a lot of World War II radioactive themes kind of feel to us today. But you do a really good job of situating and contextualizing how that came to be. And one of the sentences in the book that really stopped me short, and I think will be surprising to many readers that you sort of build toward, is when you write that the Atomic Energy Commission actually transformed ecology. This is a quote from page 116, transformed ecology from an esoteric discipline to an internationally recognized branch of biology. And that was one of the moments reading the book when I had to put it down and take a moment to step away and think about the implications of the story that you're telling and the real shift that happens as a result of, as you describe it, atomic colonialism. And I think that really gets to the heart of a lot of the arguments that you're making there. And then again, those kinds of those twin themes of restoration and destruction. Thank you for talking through those images. There's so many more. I think if audience members are flipping through the book, they will see, images of everything from coyote pelts to George Bush, and I think that you'll see that a lot of the photos act as these wonderful entryways into the stories that you're telling, and the way that they illustrate the argument that you're making. So thank you for talking about it. Do you have a favorite image in the book?
Oh, it is probably in the conclusion, there's a photograph of a volunteer with the Coral Restoration Foundation transplanting a little piece of staghorn coral to a place where it hasn't existed before, kind of anticipating where it might thrive under climate change. And I think it's such it's such an interesting photograph. Again, it's that really interventionist work, made even more so visible because it's underwater. Yeah, and I think the ways in which restoration is done in oceans is just a particularly, there's so any graduate students in the audience listening, there's so much work to be done there and questions to be asked.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about that image is it shows kind of what the work can look like. And there's so much in the narrative of the book and in these photographs about what happens when you take these academic ideas about what restoration ecology can do, and then you actually think about, how to employ it as practitioners, and whether that's done by scientists or by the state, or toward the end of your narrative by NGOs and private corporations and that kind of thing. Yeah, it's just great. So I wanted to kind of just have a little bit of final discussion before we turn things over to audience Q&A. And I think, the final theme that I really wanted to invite you to talk about goes back in a way to your own professional history as a wetlands ecologist turned environmental historian, as a way of inviting, some discussion about, for lack of a better word, the importance of interdisciplinarity, and the way that engaging with the best kind of scholarship in ecological sciences and in the humanities is really essential to doing the kind of work that you're exploring in the book, and doing it well. So one of my favorite parts of the story is how much it really does lay bare the need for the humanities in the way that we do scientific research, and in particular the need for good historical scholarship in the pursuit of ecological restoration. So I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about how humanistic and historical thinking has benefited ecological restoration. And of course, what many of your stories show throughout the book is the opposite, how ignoring the humanities can lead us into trouble.
Yeah, I think that, the question of within restoration ecology and conservation biology, the question of which species live and which are killed is often treated as a technical question or a scientific question. And I think my broadest project is to point out that that is a political question and an ethical question, and to ask who, I look at the history of restoration, so who was empowered to make these decisions and how were they made, but with the goal of pointing us toward the future, and asking who should make these decisions, who should be empowered to do restoration. And I think this is where the humanities are the disciplines that guide us. And over the course of researching the book, I kind of locked in on the term of design as really a domain of thinking that that has the capacity to acknowledge both human authorship and human aesthetic, but also leave room for other species to what I call co-design, but to have a say in where and how they live. And there are so many parallel conversations happening right now in the environmental humanities, landscape architecture and architecture, and restoration ecology. And it's my, kind of hope with the work that I'm doing now to bring those conversations together. Because I think the humanities also point us toward the need to, I ideally think, I think that the book, I get asked this question in book talks sometimes, like there are a lot of examples in the book that I give where I'm really critical of prior restoration practices, the ways that they displaced people from their homes, the ways in which in terms of nuclear colonialism, they killed people. And so to end with saying that restoration is hopeful, I think some people question that move, right? But I do think that ecological restoration has the capacity to be a way to make amends for injustices of the past, not only injustices against biodiversity, but also injustices against people. And I think there are a few interesting contemporary restoration projects. There's only a handful of them right now, but I want to advocate for more such projects that are twinning the goals of biodiversity restoration and social justice. So the work of the Intertribal Buffalo Council, which is a group of 80 nations that manage tens of thousands of bison with the goal of both ecosystem restoration and also social regeneration and restoration, and bringing back home bison to indigenous homelands. And then there's some interesting projects in Canada right now, actually. The Portlands Floodlands, I'm going to butcher the name on this, but the Portlands project that's happening in Toronto right now, where they are restoring the mouth of the Don River, and the project incorporates affordable housing for 20,000 people, as well as 75 acres of wetlands habitat. And so I would argue that's a project that is trying to bring together social justice and biodiversity restoration into the same framework.
Fascinating. All right, thank you. I want just to do one final thing before we turn to audience Q&A. There was a passage in your epilogue that I'd like to ask you to read, if you don't mind, and maybe say a bit about how you arrived at this way of conceptualizing a set of concerns that your book illuminates. So the passage is from, I sent it to you before we started talking. It's from page 229. It's one that for me, I thought I might serve as it served as this beautiful summation that was in your epilogue, and I think it's the right way to close out our conversation here before we turn things over to the audience, if you don't mind.
Sure. And this, again, as Tracy said, is from the epilogue. The history of ecological restoration in the United States reveals that caring for wild species has often gone hand in hand with harming marginalized people. Ecological restoration is a powerful response to environmental degradation, but it is not merely a technical solution. Restoration targets our moral and political matters, as well as logistical and scientific ones. everyone involved with ecological restoration, from policymakers and land managers to ecologists and other scholars, has the obligation to scrutinize which processes and events restoration attempts to undo, and which cultural practices it criticizes implicitly and explicitly. I'm going to go on to say that, attempting to offset wetland filling for a Walmart project kind of differs both conceptually and ethically from attempting to reverse the effects of federal predator eradication in the early 20th century. But these both fall under the category of ecological restoration. It's easy to conflate them. So by having familiarity with environmental history and the humanities kind of enables us to ask the question of a restoration project, like which particular historical harms is this project trying to undo, and how do we address the root causes of environmental damage at the same time as trying to undo the ecological effects of that damage. Because without looking at root causes and changing our practices, restoration is only a temporary band-aid.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's great. At this point, I think we're going to shift to audience Q&A and invite Roland back into the conversation.
Thank you, Tracy. And we have some time for Q&A now, and we've gotten several questions from our audience of about 70 people, and they are joining us from around the country, of course, but also from Chile, Brazil, India, Turkey, Germany, and a couple of other places. So what I will do now is I'll do my best to get to as many of the questions as I can. Tracy also and I can jump in with our own questions in the 20 minutes or so that remain. But if you haven't submitted a question yet, audience members, please feel free to do so with the Q&A function on Zoom. Let me just jump right in with the first question that came in, which I think is a great one. It goes like this. Thank you for your wonderful book. Given that American science tends to be globally hegemonic, do you have any insight how American modes of restoration ecology, for instance, the doomsday research for post-nuclear landscapes, the strong focus on particular species like the crane, travel to other world regions or specific countries? Has restoration ecology in other countries followed American science, or are there discernible national paradigms elsewhere?
Great question. Thank you. There both are true. There has been a strong exportation of American-based restoration ideas to other countries. I think the most important and widespread example right now is the idea of carbon offsetting. And in the final chapter of the book, I look at the kind of intellectual and policy history of offsetting, which has its, so carbon offsetting is paying someone to sequester carbon or reduce carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas production elsewhere. So it's continuing to pollute in one place and offsetting it with a restorative action elsewhere. One mode of carbon offsetting is forestry-based carbon offsetting, which is planting trees in order to sequester carbon dioxide to try and offset greenhouse gas production elsewhere. Carbon offsetting, interestingly, has its roots in wetlands restoration. So I, in the last chapter of the book, detail the history of wetlands mitigation, which happens under the Clean Water Act in the United States. And basically, it's really hard not to go into like the deep details about this because I care about this example so much. But in summary, restoration becomes consolidated in the 1990s under the Clinton and Bush administrations as developers. So developers under the Clean Water Act are required to try and avoid damaging wetlands in their projects. They convince regulators that if they can't avoid damaging a wetland, that rather than kill that project, the federal government can give them permission to do restoration to compensate for that wetlands damage. So this is the idea of compensatory mitigation, the idea that damage in one place can be compensated for with restoration elsewhere. At first, those projects are on site. If you're building a Walmart and you pave over a wetland, you're required by the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers in the United States to create a wetland elsewhere on site to kind of compensate for that wetlands loss. But during the 1990s, again, the idea of offsite mitigation emerges. So now there are wetland banks that are a place that's 100 miles away from that Walmart, and Walmart can pay for restoration to happen 100 miles away. This is the kind of policy framework that very explicitly gets exported to the UN, and through UN negotiations gets exported to REDD+ and to many other countries. And so there is an example of a very US based history of restoration being exported elsewhere at a massive scale. But there's many other examples of culturally contingent and locally based restoration that happens outside of the United States that is not influenced by US landscape ideals. There's interesting work on the restoration of cultural landscapes. I'm thinking of scholarship particularly on the restoration of cultural landscapes in Italy and in India, where restoration ecologists are considering the restoration of agricultural land and urban land in their kind of ideals of what restoration landscapes will look like in the future. And some of the work that's happening under the new EU law on restoration is also more expansively thinking about biodiversity restoration as including cultural restoration.
Thank you. Yeah. Here's a kind of different question from the audience. Industrial scale food production has led to reduced diversity of agricultural crops. Do you see your work having an impact on the path that is taken given large scale production is needed for an increasing population?
So not so much in this book, but in my broader work, I am, I'd say one thing I find so compelling about ecological restoration is that it can happen anywhere. There's been in recent years in environmental, both within conservation biology and in environmental policy circles, a real push toward an increase in preservation, in setting aside more land as protected areas. So currently around 17% of terrestrial area and 8% of marine area globally is under some form of legal protection. Whether that's strict protection, meaning that people are not allowed to live within those borders, or kind of other forms of protection that might include restrictions on resource use. A number of scientists, including the late E.O. Wilson, have argued that that number needs to go up, that percentage needs to go up dramatically in order to save species. That before he died, E.O. Wilson wrote Half Earth, arguing that half of the world should be set aside for biodiversity preservation. This has incredible consequences for, one paper, I'm forgetting the author's names, but one paper estimated that something like 2 billion people would have to move, would be forced to move from their homes in order to set aside half of the world in biodiversity preserves. It also has huge implications for agriculture. So if you're taking land out of production and for biodiversity, then you are not using it for things like food and fiber production. So here's where I think that restoration is the way forward, and that restoration has much more promise than preservation, because restoration can happen anywhere. I focus in the book on examples in kind of natural areas that are under federal or state jurisdiction, but restoration also happens in agricultural settings. There's not so much of a legal or regulatory framework for it in the United States right now. It's much more happening on a volunteer basis. But I do think that there's real potential for more restoration to happen in residential areas and in agricultural areas, and that there's a lot of work done now in regenerative agriculture, focused more on restoring soil productivity and soil structure, thinking about soil organisms that can be connected to biodiversity restoration, thinking about what other species are supported in farmlands and rangelands.
Can I follow up with this is my own question, but it's something that I wondered about since the middle of your conversation with Tracy. On the one hand, it's about restoration, the concept. On the one hand, it's clearly a contested concept in the sense that there are different definitions of it, and it's not as straightforward as a layman might think it would be. On the other hand, you make the observation that there's a lot of governmental and institutional and corporate investment in restoration. This must lead to contradictions. It must lead to different definitions of restoration being pushed forward at the same time in contradictory ways. Or would that be accurate, or are there examples of that kind of thing that you could share with us?
Yeah, that is accurate. And I think we're going to see as restoration projects really scale up, we're going to see more and more conflicts between different kind of institutional definitions of restoration. Already there are conflicts between, I keep going back to forest-based carbon offsetting, but corporations and governments that are funding carbon capture. So for that, you would want to plant a tree species that grows quickly so that it will sequester as much carbon as quickly as possible, because the goal is offsetting greenhouse gases and removing them from the atmosphere. So if that's your goal, if that's your one goal, then you would be planting fast-growing species at massive scale. A monoculture of one fast-growing tree species is not going to support the highest number of, let's say, bird species. So there already we see conflict between the restoration goals of corporations and governments that are funding forest-based carbon offsetting and the restoration goals of entities like Conservation International that are attempting to increase the number of bird species in a particular area. And so you see those sorts of conflicts where both groups are claiming that they are doing restoration work. It's work that's being done under the umbrella of restoration, but with two quite different goals. You also see different organizations doing restoration, often having differing opinions on whether a particular non-native invasive species should be removed or not. And so there's conflict in that way. And I think there's the question going forward of accountability and monitoring as a lot of money is about to be put toward restoration projects. Are these projects going to be greenwashing, or are they going to be accountable in some way?
Thank you. That's illuminating. Back to the questions from the audience. The point about conifers being more resilient to radiation made me wonder. This is an audience member speaking, not me. In your research, did you encounter any policy decisions or discussions by state actors about ecological design as strategic defense? I'm thinking specifically around the Cold War era.
Yes, and I'm so glad that this audience member asked this question, because I only have a few paragraphs about it in the book, but it's an incredible area for research. So the explicit goal of some of these experiments was to try and was national defense planning. It was the Atomic Energy Commission funding ecologists to figure out what various landscapes would look like after a nuclear attack, with the goal both of planning, there's an amazing, I'm not going to be able to quickly enough pull up the quote, but an amazing document produced by the Atomic Energy Commission that's like, we've spent all this money scenario planning for cities and what will happen to cities, but like what will happen to all of the other species in the world, and what implications will that have for economic recovery. And so the goal of these World War III simulations was to envision what would happen to the landscape, but also there were a few documents. It was never implemented at any sort of scale, but there were recommendations by the Rand Corporation, for example, to the military that particular species could be planted that would be more either radiation tolerant or blast tolerant than other species. So there were a few planners that were starting to think about, like, maybe you could plant a conifer forest and it would be more likely to survive World War III, but that never, those kind of ended as planning exercises.
Interesting, thank you. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got from this project, Wild by Design, to your current work on herbicides?
Yeah, so I, in researching this project, did a deep dive into the US Fish and Wildlife Service archives. And during World War II, the Fish and Wildlife Service collaborated with the military to try and find new uses for chemical weapons. To try and identify new chemical weapons. So using non-human species as models to see like what was toxic and what could be weaponized against humans, but also after the war ended to try and like do something new with all of these chemical weapons that had been developed. And so I was reading the lab notes of scientists that were using chemical weapons to poison coyotes, and imagining that this would be, their argument was that it would be already coyotes and other predators were being killed at massive scale by the federal government, by the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular. And a lot of scientists felt that chemical control, as they called it, would be more humane than the practices at the time, which were steel leg traps and shooting. And so wildlife restorationists were really excited, or managers were really excited about this new technology of organic chemistry and chemical weapons. And so that really intrigued me to see that kind of intersection of military history, the history of synthetic organic chemistry coming from fossil fuel feedstocks, and attempts to manage wildlife. So I became interested in the history of chemistry through kind of that route. And then in thinking about the biodiversity crisis that is facing us, there's a lot of emphasis in ecology and conservation biology on the ways in which landscapes are being homogenized at a global scale. The number of species are decreasing globally. Within any given species, the number of individuals is decreasing radically. I mean, there's one paper that came out a few years ago that estimates that humans have decreased the total mass of wild mammals on Earth by 83%. And so biodiversity is declining along all of these different metrics. And I became interested in the question of how we might tell a materialist history that helps to explain some of this decline. I've been focused very much on ideas about nature and how ideas about nature get implemented through management and then shape physical landscapes and shape the lives of other species. With my current book project, I'm interested in how biocides and how herbicides in particular have reshaped life on Earth. I'm looking at 2,4-D, which was the world's first synthetic herbicide. It's still on the market today. It's the synthetic herbicide that's been on the market for the longest, and it was the globally most used herbicide until the early 2000s when Roundup eclipsed it. And this is a product that is made from fossil fuels. It's one that was like a waste product that was kind of an accidental discovery. And the interesting thing about 2,4-D is that it is a selective herbicide. So it kills broadleaf species, dicots, but does not kill monocots. And monocots include grasses. So that makes it an incredibly powerful agricultural tool, because if you're growing something that isn't grass, like wheat or corn, or sugar, then you can spray this and it will kill everything except for your crop. But it is also used, I realized through Wild by Design, that it's used at massive scale in conservation landscapes as well, and in restoration. It's used to kill invasive species, again, at a massive scale. And it's used in residential landscapes to kill things like dandelions and thistles. And so I realized, like, here's this one compound that's being used globally in every ecosystem. It selects for grasses. So I am interested in kind of how this chemical is creating grasscapes around the world, and how that is providing less suitable habitat for species around the world.
We're going to wrap up pretty soon with a couple of more public oriented and sort of practical questions from the audience, but let me try to just slide this one in before we're done. You mentioned, again, audience member speaking here, you mentioned U.S. landscape ideals being applied to the UN and other international organizations' ecological policies. In 5 to 10 words, thank you, audience member, for doing my job. In 5 to 10 words, could you summarize what those US's ideals are, i.e., what type of features they attribute to the ideal landscape they are seeking for? And do you think those ideals have moral dimensions as well?
I'm not going to accomplish 5 to 10 words. I will strive for concision. I think this isn't so much as an ideal as an idea, but I think that one idea embedded in UN policy and promotion of ecological restoration is the idea of fungibility, the idea that one place can be substituted for another place, or that one ecosystem can be substituted for another ecosystem, that damage in one place can be compensated for with restoration in a different place. As you can tell, this is something that I am not convinced by, that before the justice questions at the heart of it, that if you have a community that's experiencing ecological degradation and you do restoration somewhere else in response, that community is not enjoying the benefits of restoration. And that community somewhere else maybe has no say in whether that restoration project is happening or not. And so I believe in the coupling of damage and restoration, and that restoration should be locally focused. So I think that this kind of distance, this restoration at a different distance, this kind of separation of damage and repair is a specifically US idea that is being embedded in international policy right now.
Okay, thank you. This is a question from the audience I've been saving for near the end. Laura, could you please talk about the simplest strategy, in your opinion, that should be implemented on a global scale to help restore and ensure ecological stability in the long run? By simplest, I mean a strategy that any human can implement.
So on some level, I think that restoration is incredibly complicated and there is no simple, but I also, on the other hand, there is something there. Restoration can be very simple, because restoration is taking action to try and help another species thrive. And I think one of the takeaways from Wild by Design is that restoration requires labor, that restoration is a choice by humans to take action to nurture another species. And so in the simplest terms, what an individual can do is to cultivate another species and put it into the landscape. And there are some, what makes it a little less simple is that in any national context or state context, there are going to be laws about which species one can and cannot work with. So in the US context, it would be illegal to work with an endangered species without a federal permit. And it would be illegal in some states to plant a species that's considered to be a noxious weed. That would be breaking a state level law. But putting aside those caveats, it's possible in one's community, at one's university, in one's backyard, in local natural areas, to do rewilding work. rewilding, I've been thinking about, should I embrace that term as what
Mhm.
my research program is and what I do. My worry about the term rewilding is that it does maybe sound like something apolitical.
Mhm.
I worry about that because I do think designing spaces for other species is a political act, just like designing spaces for people is a political act. But I would say the simplest terms, kind of spending hours working directly with a species to attempt to help it in the way that the volunteers for the International Crane Foundation were kind of intimately working with cranes. And I hope for a future in which such labor is compensated as well. I mean, so much of restoration work right now is volunteer based. And we will see with this kind of investment in restoration, whether that equals an investment in laborers and in people, or whether there's a desire for economic efficiency there and toward kind of big projects that aren't so fine or locally based and really small scale. But I think it is I would encourage us all to think about that smaller scale and what we as individuals can do. At the same time, I think that individual action is never going to be enough with any environmental crisis.
I think that questioner speaks for a lot of us who, on the one hand, appreciates the complexity of the problem, and on the other hand, has that instinctive response. What can we do? Especially when we read a book like this and we think we must have a role to play. So thank you for that. This is my very last question, and feel free to be brief in answering it. Especially after hearing you today and your conversation with Tracy, but also just reading the book over the last couple of weeks. We are proud that the Stanford Humanities Center played a role in incubating a book like this. You were here during the pandemic, the all pandemic year, as I called it, of 2021, when we were virtual. The whole year we were virtual. And I wonder if from this vantage point now, 3 years later, and now that the book is out, can you just reflect for us a little bit on what that year was like for you, and perhaps what you gained and what the challenges were? I'm sure the other former fellows in the audience and current fellows would love to hear just a few words about that.
Yeah, it was not the year that I imagined, or it was not the year that anyone imagined. It was a really difficult year wherever you were in the world, and I'm grateful to have been at the SHC. It was kind of incredible. It's kind of incredible in retrospect that we were able to form a community. And if you remember back to that time, we didn't know, we didn't have the benefit of hindsight. Like, we didn't know what the next week was going to be. We didn't know if we were going. So I was just, as we were just signing on, we were reflecting on how we did end up getting to be in our offices in the center just for the last 2 weeks of the fellowship, right? But week to week, we didn't know, could we meet in person? Would we be able to be in the center? But we managed to find a way to meet online. The fellowship really provided time for us to finish projects, to start new projects. I finished the edits for Wild by Design while a fellow, responded to reviewers, and kind of started on this next book project on herbicides that I'm working on now. And it really was an opportunity to talk about my work within a broader community of humanists, to think about, like, how do I, over and over again practicing, how do I describe my project to an art historian, to a classicist, to a linguistics scholar. Like, helped me to refine my my arguments and to speak to a broader audience.
Well, Tracy really brought out in her comments the way that those kinds of perspectives are sort of baked into the book, which I really appreciate, and I know that the readers will notice that as she did. As we wrap up here, I just want to thank you both. Tracy, what can I say? That was an incredibly wonderful intervention, guiding along the conversation and pulling out so many salient threads that readers will notice and that will be responsible for much of the impact of the book. That was just wonderful. Thank you so much. And Laura, it's great to have you back, even though virtually, and we hope to see you. In fact, both of you, we'd love to see you both in person at the center before too long. But thanks for both of you for helping us create this occasion to celebrate Wild by Design. A little bit of concluding business here. Everyone who registered for today's event was automatically entered into a drawing to receive a copy of Wild by Design, and I would like to announce the winners. They are we always do it. One is a Stanford student, one is an alum, and one is a community member. So the Stanford student is Annie Rosen, the alum is John Sherman, and the community member is Dorna Sadat. Congratulations to the three of you. We will be in touch with you by email to furnish you with your copy. And to everybody in the audience, again, thank you so much for joining us virtually today for our first event of the year. I hope you can return either in person or online, as we have a very intellectually lively fall quarter ahead. Let me particularly draw your attention to a couple of events. On October 12th and 13th, we are co-sponsoring a symposium to commemorate the 60-year anniversary of the momentous events in the civil rights struggles of 1963. It's entitled 1963 Then and Now, a 60-year retrospective of America. We're co-presenting that with Stanford's Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute, and it will take place here at the center in person and also hybrid. And on November 1st, we welcome Joe Fox, historian of 20th century Europe, who serves as Dean and Chief Executive of the School of Advanced Study at the University of London, which is the UK's National Centre for Research in the Humanities. Her talk here is appropriately titled Humanities Futures, and it's part of our continuing series called All This Rising, the Humanities in the Next 10 Years. That's November 1st. As I've mentioned, nearly everything we do is hybrid, meaning it's presented in person and online. Details always available on our website, shc.stanford.edu. So from all of us here at the Stanford Humanities Center, thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Tracy and Laura. We look forward to 2023-24 and hope to find you in our community over the next year. Until next time.